They stand still, not out of paralysis, but from something more ancient, more rehearsed. The rhythm of obedience. Look around. People move with a certain invisible gravity. They obey traffic signals, nod politely at authority, stay quiet when their soul wants to scream, but not because they're told to. No, not anymore. That's not how control works now. Today is softer, it's quieter, and that makes it far more dangerous. The most effective form of control is the one that doesn't look like control at all. There are no chains, no watchtowers, no barbed wire fences, only rituals, expectations, and an overwhelming fear of being different. Then the tyranny isn't external, it's internalized. Why do we obey? Why do we stay? What are we really afraid of? In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment that became infamous. Participants were told to deliver increasingly painful electric shocks to a person they couldn't see, just because someone in a lab coat told them to. Most people complied, despite the screams, despite their own doubts. Not because they were evil, but because they were trained to obey, trained to trust authority, trained to choose order over conscience. Then came Solomon Ash. In a room full of actors, a lone subject would be asked to compare line lengths. The answer was obvious, but when everyone else in the room gave the wrong answer, the subject, alone, in their sanity, often conformed, not because they believed it, but because it was easier to go along than to stand alone. This is the core of the illusion. We're not held down by force. We're held in place by the quiet fear of exclusion. Now, imagine someone watching all this, not participating, not rebelling either, just observing, a silent outlier at the edge of the crowd. They don't shout, they don't fight, they simply walk away. And in that moment, the system, built on participation, approval, and presence, loses its power over them. That is the most radical act of all. Not protest, not violence, but departure. You see, control depends on engagement. The machine only works when you keep feeding it your energy, your attention, your belief. Walk away and the illusion cracks. The power, once so omnipotent, begins to panic. Because what do rulers fear more than a revolution? They fear irrelevance. This idea isn't new. It echoes across time. In ancient Rome, power was theater. Emperors paraded through the streets in triumph, not just to celebrate, but to be seen, to remind people who ruled. But what happens when no one shows up to watch the parade? The emperor still walks, but to an empty street. That's not power. That's performance without an audience. In modern society, the parade never ends, but it's dressed in new clothes. Brands, celebrities, political campaigns, digital influence. Attention is currency. Engagement is obedience. And the great irony, the more you think you're choosing, the less you actually are. We scroll, we like, we share. We express outrage at the latest scandal, then move on to the next dopamine hit. We are participants in a game we didn't design and can't win, because the rules are invisible, and so is the master. This is the tyranny of influence. Not through punishment, but through perception, through framing, through subtle cues that tell us what's acceptable, what's desirable, what's normal, and deviation becomes deviance. But here's the truth buried beneath centuries of manipulation. Control only works when you care, when you need their approval, when you're still trying to win a game they rigged from the start. What happens when you stop needing it? When you stop playing? The answer is unsettling, because it means letting go of identity, safety, and belonging. But it also means freedom. Pure, unbought, untamed freedom. And it is here, at this exact crossroad, that we hear the faint footsteps of a man history has both demonized and misunderstood. Niccolo Machiavelli. He understood something most people ignore. That power isn't about strength, it's about perception. That control isn't maintained by chains, but by optics, by manipulation, by mastering the performance of authority. And more importantly, he knew what it meant to lose power, to be exiled, to be invisible. And from that position, detached from the illusion, he could see it for what it truly was. Machiavelli is often remembered as the architect of tyranny, but that's a mistake. He wasn't preaching cruelty. He was describing it, documenting how rulers manipulate fear, reward, and spectacle to maintain control, not to glorify it, but to expose it. And what he exposed is what we still live under today. The world hasn't changed, only the costumes have. But the act of walking away, of refusing to participate, that threatens everything. Because when you withdraw your belief, your obedience, your identity, the system can no longer control you. You become untouchable. Not because you're strong, but because you're indifferent. And that is the true heresy. This isn't a call to burn down the system. That would only confirm its importance. This is something quieter, more subversive, a philosophy of absence, of disengagement, of watching the machine run without you and realizing it needs you far more than you need it. We begin this journey with eyes wide open, a slow unraveling of everything we've been told is real, not to escape, but to understand, to recognize the nature of the game so deeply that we can finally choose whether to play or simply silently walk away. Because when you walk away, they don't just lose you, they lose control. There's a name that echoes through history like a whispered threat. Machiavelli. For centuries he has been vilified, reduced to a symbol of cunning, cruelty, and deceit. His name, more cursed than legacy. The word Machiavellian became synonymous with manipulation and moral bankruptcy, but this version is a mask, a convenient villain, a caricature built by those who understood the danger of his ideas, but feared their implications. Because in truth, Machiavelli wasn't advocating tyranny. He was revealing how it works. Born into the turbulence of Renaissance Florence, Niccolo Machiavelli lived through the chaos of collapsing republics, foreign invasions, and backroom betrayals. He wasn't writing from an ivory tower. He was a man who had seen power stripped, rebuilt, and weaponized. And from this vantage point, he studied the anatomy of control, not as it should be, but as it is. His most infamous work, The Prince, is not a moral guidebook. It's a mirror, a reflection of how leaders maintain order in a world where truth is fragile and loyalty is currency. One of his most haunting lessons: a leader does not need to be good. He only needs to appear good, because perception, Machiavelli argued, is more powerful than reality. People don't follow truth. They follow images, symbols, stories. The masses rarely peer beneath the surface. And those who do, they're often too afraid to speak. This is the machinery of control. Not truth, but optics. Not virtue, but the performance of virtue. He writes that a ruler must be like both the lion and the fox, strong enough to crush enemies, clever enough to avoid traps. But more importantly, he must seem noble, generous, and just, even while being none of those things. Because power doesn't survive by being honest. It survives by being believed. This isn't just political philosophy, it's psychological insight. Because at the heart of obedience lies a deeper fear, the fear of instability. People crave order, even when it's fake. They will choose the illusion of peace over the reality of chaos. And a ruler who understands this can exploit it endlessly. Consider this. Machiavelli didn't live in the age of digital surveillance, social media, or brand cults. But his insights feel eerily modern. Today, politicians smile for cameras while waging invisible wars. Corporations speak of ethics while exploiting labor. Algorithms curate reality so subtly that we no longer know what's true. And we, the audience, applaud the spectacle, so long as the mask remains intact. Because the modern ruler is no longer a monarch. It's a network, an institution, a platform. It speaks in data, not decrees. Its power is quiet, ambient, invisible, and yet the tactics remain Machiavellian. To illustrate, look not at kings but CEOs. They speak in soft tones about innovation, inclusion, purpose, but beneath the surface lies ruthless strategy, masked, surveillance, behavioral manipulation, market domination. Just like the princes of Machiavelli's world, they understand that the appearance of benevolence is more important than its reality. Even the most well-meaning government learns this lesson. It knows that citizens will tolerate inequality, corruption, and incompetence, so long as the illusion of democracy and morality is maintained. A well-crafted narrative, a symbolic gesture, a villain to blame, it's often enough to maintain order. Machiavelli wasn't endorsing this. He was decoding it. He knew that fear is a more reliable tool than love, not because fear is noble, but because it works. Fear sharpens attention. It reduces complexity. It binds people to the very force they dread. Because in a strange twist of psychology, fear creates dependence. Modern psychology confirms what Machiavelli intuited. B.F. Skinner's experiments with operant conditioning showed how behavior can be shaped through systems of reward and punishment. Give the subject a treat, they repeat the behavior. Give them pain, they avoid it. But here's the trick. Intermittent reinforcement, randomly alternating reward and punishment, is the most addictive of all. It mimics real life. It mimics modern control. Social media, for instance, uses this principle relentlessly. One moment, a post goes viral and you feel validated. The next, you're ignored and forgotten. That uncertainty breeds addiction. You keep playing, keep posting, keep feeding the machine, just like lab rats pressing a lever in hopes of cheese. Machiavelli would have understood this. He would have marveled at it. Not because it's virtuous, but because it reveals how obedience can be manufactured without force. And so the optics evolve. Where once rulers built statues and held parades, now they build platforms and algorithms. Where once obedience was extracted through threat of violence, now it's extracted through the architecture of influence. Soft power, branding, trust is all theater. But Machiavelli taught us that the theater is the power. Even dissent can be co-opted. The system allows for controlled rebellion. Protests are televised. Outrage is monetized. Movements are absorbed, branded, and sold back to the public. The appearance of freedom becomes the latest mask. So convincing we forget. We are still being watched, and yet buried within Machiavelli's cynicism is an odd kind of hope. Because to understand these mechanisms is to begin reclaiming agency. If power survives through optics, then awareness disrupts the illusion. If control operates through fear, then detachment breaks the spell. The very act of seeing how manipulation works creates a crack in the system, a space where something else can emerge, not obedience, not rebellion, but autonomy. This is why Machiavelli was feared, not because he taught princes how to dominate, but because he taught citizens how to recognize domination. He removed the mask. And once you see the mask, you can never unsee it. The real question becomes, what do you do once you see? Do you fight? Do you expose? Or do you walk away? Machiavelli never gave us that answer. He wasn't a prophet. He was a strategist, a map maker. He charted the landscape of power, not to tell us where to go, but to show us what lies beneath our feet. And what lies beneath is uncomfortable because it means realizing that power isn't just something others have over us. It's something we participate in. We enable it through belief, through engagement, through silence. Understanding Machiavelli's mind is like standing at the edge of a great stage and realizing the play is rigged, but also realizing you don't have to play your part anymore. You can leave the stage. You can stop clapping. You can disrupt the script, not with noise, but with awareness. Because when perception becomes weaponized, clarity is resistance. And in a world governed by illusions, the most dangerous person is the one who sees clearly and refuses to act the role they've been assigned. This was Machiavelli's true gift. Not advice for tyrants, but insight for the observant. Not cruelty, but clarity. Not control, but consciousness. And the moment we reclaim that consciousness, we don't just understand power. We begin to unmake it. We like to believe we are free. Free to choose, free to speak, free to live on our own terms. But what if freedom as we know it is not real? What if it's a carefully curated experience, designed not to liberate us, but to pacify us? George Orwell warned of a future where freedom would be crushed under the weight of surveillance and force. But Aldous Huxley offered a subtler nightmare, a world where people are not enslaved by chains, but by pleasure, not silenced by fear, but distracted by comfort. And in that world, the most dangerous kind of prison is the one you can't see. This is the illusion of freedom, a life where obedience feels like choice, where conformity feels like individuality, and where the most powerful forms of control don't look like control at all. Look around, we are surrounded by systems, educational, economic, political, technological, that do not ask for our submission with threats. They invite it through incentives, through rituals, through identity. We are told to pursue success, but the ladder is fixed. We are told to speak our minds, but only within the boundaries of what's acceptable. We are told we are free, but we are nudged, filtered, tracked, and conditioned at every turn. This is not control with whips and chains. It's control through design. In modern workplaces, obedience is not extracted with punishment. It's rewarded with praise, with promotions, with stability, the open plan office, the company mission, statement, the productivity software, all shape behavior without ever needing to command it. You're not forced to conform. You're encouraged to. It's the smart thing to do, the mature thing, the responsible thing, and so the illusion deepens. You internalize the rules. You begin to police yourself. You wake up not because you're told to, but because the calendar demands it. You work not because you're being watched, but because your value has been tied to your output. Your identity becomes a role. Your role becomes a duty, and duty becomes the cage. It's operant conditioning at scale, just as B.F. Skinner observed. Reward compliance, ignore resistance, normalize obedience until it no longer feels like obedience. Social media plays the same game. It doesn't need to force your attention. It just needs to predict it. It offers likes, hearts, followers, a reward for conformity. Say the right things, echo the right outrage, align with the right tribe, and you are lifted. Step outside the line and you are punished, not with violence, but with silence. Shadow banned, unfollowed, forgotten. And in politics, the system is even more cunning. You are told to choose between two sides, red or blue, left or right, but the structure remains unchanged. The faces change. The theater evolves, but the machinery keeps turning. You feel involved. You feel empowered. You voted, you marched, you posted, but nothing truly shifts because power has learned a critical lesson. You don't need to suppress rebellion. You only need to redirect it. Let people scream. Let them protest. Let them express their rage. So long as it's within the boundaries set by the system, rage becomes a product. Dissent becomes entertainment, a release valve that prevents the pot from boiling over. This is how institutions preserve themselves, not through oppression, but through integration. They adapt, they absorb critique, they evolve just enough to survive. Even education, once a path to liberation, becomes a funnel. Students are taught to memorize, not to question, to prepare for tests, not for truth. The system rewards obedience. It filters out the troublemakers. It grooms the compliant. By the time you graduate, the mold is set. You know how to follow rules, how to chase metrics, how to fear failure. You've learned to fit in, to compete, to obey, all while believing you're free. This is the genius of modern control. It doesn't demand submission. It makes you want it. It seduces you with comfort, distracts you with noise, and convinces you that your cage is a castle. But every now and then something breaks the illusion. A moment of silence, a question, a flash of clarity. You wonder, why am I doing this? Who am I doing it for? Is this really me? And that's when the system responds. It doesn't send soldiers. It doesn't issue threats. It uses language. It labels you lazy, difficult, conspiratorial, depressed, extremist. Opting out becomes pathology. Doubt becomes heresy. The moment you question the game, you are branded as broken. This is not an accident. It's a defense mechanism, because true freedom is dangerous to those who benefit from compliance. It cannot be bought. It cannot be managed. It cannot be predicted. And so the system builds stories. Stories that make obedience feel like virtue and independence feel like failure. The man who walks away from the corporation is irresponsible. The woman who rejects social media is a recluse. The thinker who questions the narrative is a threat. We're told that if we're not playing the game, we're losing. That if we reject the path, we're falling behind. But behind what? Who defined this race? Who set the course? The moment you ask, the illusion begins to crumble. And this brings us back to Machiavelli, because Machiavelli didn't just write about power, he lived it. And then one day he lost it. After serving the Florentine Republic, Machiavelli was imprisoned, tortured and exiled, stripped of influence, banished from the game he once studied so meticulously. But in exile, something remarkable happened. Freed from the performance of politics, he began to see more clearly. In his writings, we hear not just the voice of a strategist, but of a man who understands what it means to be on the outside, to be cast out from the machinery, to be free and yet feared. Machiavelli saw that true autonomy doesn't come from winning within the system. It comes from stepping beyond it. Not in rebellion, not in revolution, but in refusal. Refusal to play a role. Refusal to believe the script. Refusal to trade authenticity for approval. He understood what modern society still resists. That walking away isn't weakness. It's power. The kind of power that cannot be measured, cannot be bought, cannot be controlled. Because once you walk away, they lose their grip. You become invisible to the metrics, immune to the manipulation, a ghost in a world of puppets. And that is the greatest threat to any system built on control. A mind that no longer responds. So where does this leave us? Not in despair, but in awareness. Because once you see the cage, you can choose your relationship to it. You can play the game knowing it's a game. You can use the tools without being used. You can stay within the system without letting it define you. Or when the time comes, you can walk away, not with rage, but with clarity. And in that act of walking, the illusion breaks, the spell lifts, and what remains is something deeper than freedom, sovereignty, not granted, not given, not performed, but claimed silently, powerfully, finally. There's a rule they don't teach you, but it governs everything. The only real power they have over you is the power you give them by showing up. Control, in its purest form, needs your attention. It needs your participation. It needs your belief in the game. Because the moment you stop playing, the whole illusion begins to collapse. This is the unspoken threat hidden beneath the surface of every system. From empires to corporations, from algorithms to ideologies. Not the threat of rebellion, not the chaos of resistance, but the quiet, unnerving power of absence. To walk away is to take back what control depends on, your presence. Throughout history, the most radical act hasn't always been to fight, but to disappear. Consider Diogenes, a man who, in the midst of ancient Athens, walked barefoot, slept in a barrel, and rejected the very notion of societal status. He mocked power not with rebellion, but with disregard. When Alexander the Great, the most powerful man of his time, approached him and offered anything he desired, Diogenes didn't flatter or beg. He looked up and said, "Stand out of my sunlight." That wasn't just defiance, that was freedom. The kind of freedom that terrifies tyrants. Not because it destroys their power, but because it renders it irrelevant. Power lives in the mind. It survives through perception. And when you no longer seek its validation, it no longer holds dominion over you. This is the core of the strategy. Walking away is not surrender. It is a declaration, a refusal to be defined by a system that profits from your compliance. In a world that equates visibility with value, to disappear is to become dangerous. Our conditioned to believe that withdrawal equals failure. That stepping away from status, career, or recognition is a sign of weakness. But history tells a different story. The Buddhist monks who left kingdoms to seek truth in silence. The desert fathers who turned away from collapsing empires to live in solitude. The whistleblowers who walked away from positions of prestige, knowing that truth mattered more than comfort. To leave is to risk exile, to become invisible to a society obsessed with noise. But in that invisibility lies power, because participation is their leverage. The corporation thrives when you strive for the promotion. The algorithm feeds when you chase the likes. The political machine strengthens when you rage on cue, vote on cue, and fear on cue. But what happens when you opt out? Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, strategically. You stop chasing the next promotion. You stop curating your life for approval. You stop consuming the outrage, the division, the illusion. Suddenly they can't reach you. You're no longer afraid of social death because you've already chosen to define life on your own terms. This is the true rebellion. Not fire and fury, but detachment, disengagement, not apathy, but autonomy. In today's world, quiet quitting is framed as laziness. But what if it's not laziness? What if it's lucidity, a realization that the reward was never worth the cost, that the ladder you were climbing was leaning against a hollow wall? Minimalism, digital detoxes, off-grid living. These aren't trends, they're symptoms, signs that people are beginning to see through the spectacle. The spectacle needs your eyes, your clicks, your belief. And when you withhold them, it begins to starve. This doesn't mean you abandon everything. It means you reclaim your authorship. You decide where your time, your mind, your energy go. You choose not to dance just because the music plays, and it is a choice, a hard one, because the system is designed to make walking away feel like death. Lose your job and you lose your identity. Log off and you lose your relevance. Refuse to play the role and you become the villain of someone else's story. But that's only because they need you to stay. Every system fears one thing, an individual who no longer fears being alone. When you walk away, you break the feedback loop. You no longer validate the charade, and in doing so, you expose its fragility. Even Machiavelli, so often misunderstood as the master manipulator, was forced to walk away. After serving in the Florentine Republic, he was accused of conspiracy, tortured and exiled, stripped of his influence, cast out from the very game he studied. But exile didn't destroy him, it clarified him. In solitude, Machiavelli wrote The Prince, not to flatter the powerful, but to reveal the inner workings of power itself. He saw how rulers needed a crowd, how perception mattered more than truth, and how control was maintained not through strength, but through performance. He had been part of the system, and then he was cast out, and only then did he truly see. Sometimes, the clearest vision comes not from standing on the throne, but from standing outside the palace gates. Because power is loud, but truth whispers. And in your absence, that whisper becomes deafening. To walk away is not to escape the world. It is to meet it differently, on your terms, without the need to dominate or be dominated. It is to no longer need to be seen to exist, to no longer trade your essence for approval, to no longer depend on borrowed definitions of success, relevance, or worth. Voluntary invisibility is not erasure. It is emancipation. It means you're no longer running from the void, but sitting in it, fully awake, fully unafraid. And that is where real power lives, not in influence, not in authority, but in sovereignty. You choose when to speak, when to act, when to participate, and when to disappear. And because of that choice, because of that silence, you become untouchable. The world cannot manipulate a person who no longer fears disconnection and the systems of control. They crumble not through resistance, but through neglect, because nothing exposes the emperor's nakedness like the absence of awe. The real revolution, then, is not in changing the system. It's in becoming the kind of person who no longer needs it, not out of bitterness, not out of rage, but out of clarity. To walk away is to return to yourself. And when you do, you don't just take back your power. You take back your life. There's a reason people stay in systems that suffocate them. It isn't always fear, it's guilt. Not the kind of guilt that comes from doing something wrong, but the kind that's been carefully planted, grown over time, until it wraps itself around your sense of self. This is the invisible war, not waged with weapons or threats, but with emotions. Subtle, corrosive emotions, guilt, shame, obligation. It's not enough for systems of control to demand your obedience. They must make you want to obey, or at the very least feel wrong for wanting to leave. This is how people end up defending the very systems that oppress them, not because they are blind, but because they've been emotionally tethered to their captors. It's why the worker thanks the corporation that exploits him, why the believer fears questioning the church that shamed her, why the child grows into an adult still seeking the approval of a parent who withheld love as a form of discipline. Control isn't sustained by chains, it's sustained by stories that shape your sense of worth. From a young age, we are taught that obedience is goodness, that sacrifice is virtue, that productivity is moral. And when we deviate from those scripts, we feel defective, lazy, ungrateful. You don't have to build a prison if you can build guilt. Freud called it the superego, an internalized authority, a whispering parent in your mind that punishes you for defiance even when no one is watching. Jung spoke of the shadow, those exiled parts of ourselves that society deemed unworthy, dangerous, or selfish. These psychological forces don't disappear as we grow. They evolve. They adapt to the language of modern institutions. You feel guilty for not checking your email at night. You feel shame for resting. You apologize for saying no. And somewhere deep down, you worry that walking away makes you a failure. This is the dark genius of psychological warfare. You don't need to be chained if your mind does it for you. In religion, it's the fear of sin. In corporations, it's loyalty. In families, it's obligation. In culture, it's the myth of the grind. You internalize the idea that to stop, to rest, to leave, to disconnect is to betray something sacred. So people stay. Not because they're weak, but because they were taught that to walk away is to become invisible, meaningless, alone. This is not accidental. It is by design. High control systems, from cults to corporations, understand this perfectly. They wrap identity around participation. The more you give, the more entangled you become. Leave. And who are you? A cult survivor once said, leaving wasn't the hard part. Believing I deserved to leave, that was the war. And it is a war. A war fought not in the streets, but in the quiet of one's own mind. The voice that whispers, you can't leave. You'll be nothing without us. That voice has many faces. The employer who says, we're like family. The doctrine that says, without us, you are lost. The culture that says, if you don't produce, you don't matter. But they all speak the same language. Guilt is gravity. You carry it like weight. And the heavier it becomes, the more you confuse it with truth. But it isn't truth. It's programming. This is how hustle culture survives. Not by logic, but by shame. You feel lazy for sleeping. You feel worthless for not monetizing your hobbies. You feel anxious when you're not chasing something, so you keep running. Not toward freedom, but away from guilt, and the system thrives. Because a tired, shamed, guilty individual is easy to manipulate. They'll keep showing up, keep producing, keep performing just to feel okay again. But here's the paradox. The more you give, the more it demands. And the less you feel like you can ever leave. This is why people stay in jobs that drain them, in ideologies that no longer fit, in communities that punish authenticity, not because they believe in them, but because they've forgotten how to believe in themselves outside of them. This is the silent collapse of the self. When your identity is so interwoven with participation that the idea of stepping away feels like dying, but it's not death, it's rebirth. The moment you recognize that guilt is not truth, that shame is not a compass, you begin to peel away the layers of control. You begin to ask, who benefits from me feeling this way? And when you ask that question sincerely, things start to fracture, because guilt only works if it stays invisible. Once seen, it begins to lose power. The man who leaves the cult and finds clarity in silence. The woman who quits the high-paying job and discovers her worth wasn't tied to her title. The child who walks away from their family's expectations and builds a life from their own raw, unfiltered truth. These people didn't just escape systems. They rewrote the scripts within themselves. They faced the guilt and they didn't run from it. They stared it down. They realized that the voice saying, you are nothing without us, was a lie, a calculated lie. Because what the system fears most is not your rebellion, but your healing. When you stop feeling guilty, you stop being controllable. You become someone who can walk away not in anger, but in clarity. Someone who understands that worth is not earned through suffering, that love is not conditional on obedience, that rest is not laziness, and that walking away isn't abandonment. It's reclamation. To leave a toxic system, a job that drains you, a role that suffocates you, is to begin the work of returning to yourself. And yes, at first it feels like loss, because part of you was built to survive there. Part of you believed the story, but you are not the story. You are the author. And when you recognize that, the guilt begins to evaporate. The shame loses its grip. You stop apologizing for existing on your own terms, and that is freedom. Not the kind sold in slogans or stitched into flags, but the quiet, internal kind. The kind that doesn't beg for permission or require validation. The kind that walks away, not because it's broken, but because it remembers what wholeness feels like. They will say you are selfish. They will say you are lost. They will say you owe them. But those are the voices of the system trying to pull you back. Let them speak. You've heard them before, but this time you don't listen. Because this time you know the truth. You were never broken. You were only bound, and now you are free. There's a silence that follows the moment you walk away. It's not peace at first. It's shock, because the system never thought you would do it. It had counted on your obedience, on your fear, on your shame, on your exhaustion, but not on your exit. To walk away from a system that feeds on your participation is not a retreat. It is a revolution. The moment you stop reacting, stop arguing, defending, performing, producing, the illusion collapses. The system panics because its power was never in its strength. It was in your belief. It never needed to be omnipotent. It only needed to be inevitable. But now you've proven it isn't, and that changes everything. We've been taught that leaving means losing, that departure equals failure, that to walk away is to disappear into irrelevance. But what if irrelevance to the machine is the beginning of relevance to yourself? Throughout history, the most dangerous thing a person could do wasn't to protest the empire, it was to leave it. Diogenes rejected the wealth and prestige of Athenian society. He lived in a barrel, carried nothing, answered to no one. When Alexander the Great offered him anything he desired, Diogenes said, "Yes, step aside. You're blocking the sun." This wasn't madness. It was defiance of the highest order, because it threatened the very logic of power, that titles, wealth, and status are what make a person worthy. Diogenes proved the opposite. He didn't fight the system. He invalidated it. Camus called it absurd rebellion. Not in violent opposition, but in spiritual refusal. When life presents a rigged game, the true rebel doesn't scream at the dealer. He steps away from the table and finds meaning on his own terms. Kierkegaard called it a leap of faith, not into religion, but into the unknown, into the self, into a truth that can be calculated or confirmed by institutions. And Nietzsche shattered the foundations of morality altogether, exposing the deep divide between slave morality, built on obedience, guilt, and conformity, and master morality, which rises from self-authorship, risk, and will. To walk away is to say, I will not live by borrowed definitions. But here's the part they don't tell you. When you leave, the system doesn't forget you. It needs you, not as a person, but as a participant, a metric, a producer, a consumer, a believer. Without your attention, the algorithm starves. Without your loyalty, the brand fades. Without your conformity, the culture splinters. You were never just a cog. You were the current that powered the machine. And now that you're gone, something breaks. We are told to fear this moment. The fall from the grid, the loss of status, the exile from the hive. But in truth, it is liberation. A woman walks away from a career that demanded her soul and gave her titles in return. She has no plan, just space. At first, the silence terrifies her. Then, it heals her. A man disconnects from the screens, deletes his accounts, stops feeding the feedback loop. He walks through his city and sees it for the first time. Not as a stage, but as a story he no longer needs to narrate. A family abandons suburban safety, sells everything, moves off grid. Friends think they've lost their minds, but for the first time, they feel alive. These aren't acts of withdrawal, they are acts of authorship. To walk away is not to abandon the world. It's to stop pretending you owe it your identity. It's to say, I choose not to play. And that is the one thing control cannot process. Control is designed to handle resistance. It expects rebellion. It even co-opts it, brands it, sells it back to you. But it cannot compute absence. Absence is an existential threat. Because the system, for all its noise, is fragile. It requires constant validation to exist, constant attention to survive. Your silence is louder than any scream. Your departure more powerful than any protest. Because when you leave, you expose the truth. It was never about you. It was about your utility. And once you stop offering that, they can no longer pretend it was love. This realization is both painful and freeing. Painful because you see how much of your life was spent proving your worth to something that could never love you back. Freeing because now you don't need to. There is a kind of beauty that can only be found after the collapse, after the titles are stripped, after the applause fades, after the mirrors are smashed, and all that remains is you, the man standing before the burning city. Does not weep for it. He does not try to save it. He does not curse it. He simply turns and walks into the forest, not because he has a map, but because he no longer wants to live by theirs. That man is not lost. He is returning to something older than systems, quieter than propaganda, more real than reward. He is returning to truth, Not the kind handed down by power, but the kind discovered in silence. The kind you feel, not perform. And here the irony unfolds. They said you were weak for leaving. They said you gave up. But in truth, you did the hardest thing imaginable. You said no, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in clarity. You walked away not to escape, but to reclaim. You chose yourself. Not the curated version, not the branded persona, but the raw, uncertain self. And that choice terrifies the system, because if enough people do it, the entire structure begins to unravel, not with violence, but with irrelevance. What if power doesn't collapse in fire, but in silence? What if revolution isn't fought, but walked? And what if the greatest act of resistance is not to shout, but to disappear, to become untrackable, unprofitable, unprogrammable, to find joy outside of metrics, connection outside of screens, meaning outside of mandates? This is the power they can't touch, and it is yours the moment you choose it. So walk not in rage, not in haste, but with the calm certainty of someone who has seen the game and declined the invitation. Walk toward the unknown, toward the forest, toward the self, because the moment you walk away, the system panics, but you don't. There is no standing ovation when you walk away, no thunderous applause, no medals, no monuments. The world doesn't celebrate those who step off its stage. It forgets them. And that is the final paradox. Freedom, the kind that cannot be revoked or bought, comes without recognition. It offers no status, no praise, no reward. Because the moment it is recognized, it becomes performance again. And so it arrives quietly, like a breath after drowning. To walk away is to leave the theater of validation, to exit the story where your worth was measured in applause. You become invisible, intentionally, powerfully, beautifully invisible. But this is not the invisibility of insignificance. It is the invisibility of a life no longer lived for the gaze of others. This is the final test. Can you live without being seen? Can you matter without being measured? Can you be free, even if no one calls you brave for it? It is here that many falter, because we are taught to crave confirmation. Even our rebellions seek an audience, but true freedom needs none. It exists in the absence of permission. It is what remains when there's no one left to impress. There is a loneliness to it. Not the kind born of abandonment, but the kind born of self-realization. The loneliness of knowing that your path is no longer a product of consensus, but in this loneliness, something sacred begins to form. A stillness, a sovereignty, a life untethered. You begin to see the world not as something to conquer or escape, but as something to simply be in, on your own terms. No one may understand why you left. They might call it weakness, selfishness, insanity. But the truth is, they fear what they don't control. And nothing is more uncontrollable than someone who needs nothing from them. You become unpredictable. Not because you are chaotic, but because you're no longer driven by the same carrots and sticks, no longer bribed by praise nor paralyzed by punishment. You've left the currency of social survival behind. This is not nihilism. This is not detachment for the sake of ego. This is a return to a life rooted not in image, but in essence. Not in noise, but in depth. It is here finally that peace becomes possible. Not the peace sold by gurus or promised by ideologies, but the peace that comes from having nothing to prove. You realize that the game never needed to be won, only left behind. You realize that worth was never something to earn, only something to remember. And you realize that walking away was not the end. It was the beginning. We return now to where we started. The man stands alone, far from the city. The smoke has cleared. The fires have faded. He's not rich, not followed, not praised, but he is free. He no longer watches the world as a prisoner of it. He no longer waits for permission to exist. He walks, not to escape, but to live. Not victorious, but whole. This is the quiet glory of freedom. It cannot be given. It cannot be taught. It can only be claimed and lived without recognition, without applause. And in that silence, you will finally hear your own voice. And for the first time, you'll know it was always enough.